Wouter Winkle was a tavern owner with a problem. A very expensive problem. It's the winter of 1637. Wouter is holding 7 orphan bulbs of a tulip called the Semper Augustus. Just 7. Now, to you and me, that's a nice Mother's Day gift. Maybe $20 at Trader Joe's. But to Wouter Winkle, those 7 dirty little onions were worth enough to buy a fleet of ships. They were worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. He was holding the 17th century equivalent of a winning Powerball ticket. But there was a catch. He had to sell them now, because in exactly 48 hours, the price of that ticket was going to 0. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the Tulip Mania, the story of how the smartest people on Earth did the dumbest thing in history. Before we laugh at these guys, you have to understand the vibe. We are talking about the Dutch Republic in the early 1600s. This place was the New York City, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street of the world, all rolled into one swampy little nation. They had the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. These guys were the first multinational corporation in history. They were hauling in spices, silks, and cash by the boatload. The average merchant in Amsterdam wasn't just rich. They were build a mansion just to store my other mansions, rich. And when you have that much new money floating around, people get bored. They need something to show off. You can't just stack gold bars in your window, that's tacky. You need status. You need something rare, something your neighbor doesn't have. Enter the tulip. Now, tulips aren't native to the Netherlands. They came from the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey. When they first arrived in Europe, they were the ultimate flex. They were exotic, they were fragile, and they were notoriously hard to keep alive in the cold Dutch mud. But here's the kicker. Most tulips were just solid colors. Red, yellow, white. Boring. But every once in a while, a tulip would bloom with these insane, flame-like streaks. White with crimson stripes, yellow with purple veins. They called them broken tulips. And the Dutch lost their absolute minds over them. Here's the plot twist they didn't know. The beauty was actually a disease. The streaks were caused by the mosaic virus. The flower was literally dying. It was sick. And because it was sick, it couldn't reproduce well. That made them incredibly rare. And in Economics 101, what happens when you have unlimited money chasing a limited supply of dying flowers? To the moon, baby. To the moon. At first, this was a rich person's game. Only the elite traded these bulbs. It was like collecting Picassos. But by 1634, the FOMO hit the streets. You see, the Dutch invented something else besides corporate greed. They effectively invented the futures market. They called it wind handle, trading in the wind. Here's how it worked. Tulips only bloom in the spring. You can only physically move the bulbs in the summer when they are dormant. But people wanted to trade them all year round. So, they started trading contracts. I promise to buy this bulb from you in June for 1,000 guilders. I don't have the bulb. You don't have the money. We just have a piece of paper and a handshake. And this is where the greater fool theory kicks in. You don't buy the bulb because you like flowers. You buy it because you know some other idiot will pay you double for it next week. Let's put the numbers into perspective because guilders sounds like monopoly money. A skilled carpentera guy who actually built things earned about 250 guilders a year. A fat pig was 30 guilders. A ton of butter, 100 guilders. A single bulb of the Viceroy tulip was trading for 3,000 to 4,000 guilders. That is 20 years of salary for a root. For an onion that might die before you even get it out of the ground. Imagine walking into a bar today and the bartender tells you, "Hey, see that napkin? It's worth $500,000. Want in?" And instead of calling the cops, you mortgage your house to buy the napkin. That was Holland in 1636. Chimney sweeps, weavers, farmers, everyone liquidated their assets. They sold their tools, their livestock, even their beds to get into the market. It was the original YOLO economy. The trading moved out of the stock exchange and into the pubs. They formed colleges, which is a fancy word for a bunch of drunk guys in the back room of a tavern. There were no lawyers, no regulators, just wine, heavy smoke, and adrenaline. Every time a trade happened, the buyer had to pay a wine money fee, basically buying a round of drinks for everyone. So, the more you traded, the drunker everyone got. And the drunker everyone got, the higher the prices went. By the winter of 1636, the prices were doubling every few days. The rational world had left the building. But there's a problem with exponential growth. Eventually, you run out of fools. And as the winter snow began to melt in early 1637, the Dutch were about to wake up with the worst hangover in human history. So, we have a market fueled by alcohol, greed, and the promise of infinite returns. But to truly understand how detached from reality these people became, we need to talk about the Semper Augustus. If the tulip market was the stock exchange, the Semper Augustus was Apple, Tesla, and Bitcoin, all wrapped into one glorious, striped little package. It was the Holy Grail, the VIP section, the bulb that everyone wanted, but almost no one had seen. At the peak of the mania, in January 1637, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus was valued at 10,000 guilders. Let me say that again. 10,000 guilders. I told you earlier that a skilled carpenter made 250 a year. That means this one flower was worth 40 years of hard labor. But let's make it more tangible. For the price of that one bulb, you could buy a luxury mansion on the most fashionable canal in Amsterdam. Not a fixer-upper. A mansion, with a garden, and a coach house. Or, if real estate isn't your thing, you could buy a ship. A fully rigged commercial ship capable of sailing to the East Indies and back. Imagine walking into a car dealership today, pointing at a single lug nut on a tire, and trading a penthouse in Manhattan for it. That is where we were. The value had completely disconnected from utility. You couldn't eat the tulip. You couldn't live in it. It didn't generate dividends. It just sat in the dirt. But the belief was unshakable. Tomorrow, it will be worth 12,000. And inevitably, when money this stupid starts flying around, you get the stories, the legends, the urban myths of the 17th century that define the absurdity. The most famous one involves a sailor. The story goes like this. A merchant had just received a shipment of valuable goods from abroad. A sailor delivers the news, and the merchant, being a generous guy, gives the sailor a nice, fat red herring for his breakfast. The sailor sees what looks like an onion lying on the merchant's counter. He thinks, perfect, a little onion to go with my fish. He grabs it, slips it in his pocket, and heads down to the quay to eat his meal. He's sitting there, enjoying his herring, munching on this crunchy, slightly flavorless onion. Suddenly, the merchant comes sprinting out of the warehouse, screaming, tears streaming down his face. He finds the sailor finishing the last bite. The sailor hadn't eaten an onion. He had just eaten a Semper Augustus. He had just consumed the equivalent of the entire crew's wages for the next 3 years as a garnish for his fish. The legend says the sailor was thrown in jail for theft, but honestly, the real crime was that a vegetable was worth that much in the first place. But it wasn't just the sailors making mistakes. It was the frantic energy. People were buying bulbs that were still in the ground. They didn't know what they looked like. They didn't know if they were actually the rare, broken variety or just plain garbage. They bought future options on bulbs that the seller didn't even own yet. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of quicksand, and the wind was about to pick up. February 3rd, 1637, Haarlem, a city just west of Amsterdam. It started like any other Tuesday in the mania. The taverns were full, the smoke was thick, the wine was flowing. An auction was scheduled to sell a batch of bulbs. The auctioneer stood up. He called out a price for a pound of bulbs. Usually, hands would shoot up. People would be fighting over each other to bid. But this time, silence. Just the sound of people coughing in the smoke. The auctioneer chuckled nervously. He thought the price was too high, so he lowered it. Okay, tough crowd. How about 1,000? Silence. He lowered it again, and again, and in that moment, the spell broke. It was like someone turned on the lights at a party at 3 o'clock a.m. Suddenly, everyone looked around and realized, wait a minute. I'm holding a piece of paper that says I owe a fortune for a root, and I don't even like gardening. The psychology of a bubble is fascinating. It takes years to inflate, fueled by greed and FOMO, but it takes seconds to pop, fueled by sheer, primal terror. News traveled fast, but not instantly. There was no Twitter, no CNBC, just riders on horseback. But panic? Panic is faster than a horse. Within days, the crash hit Amsterdam. Dealers who had bought contracts the week before were now on the hook for thousands of guilders. They tried to sell to the next guy, but the next guy wasn't buying. The greater fool had finally left the building. There were no more fools left. The prices didn't just dip. They didn't correct. They evaporated. A bulb worth 5,000 guilders on Monday was worth 50 guilders on Friday. By the next week, you couldn't give them away. Chaos ensued. The courts were flooded. Sellers were suing buyers for breach of contract. Buyers were suing sellers claiming fraud. "You promised to pay 4,000 guilders!" the seller would scream. "I don't have 4,000 guilders!" the buyer would scream back. "I have a goat and 3 chairs." The economy seized up. The tavern owners, who had been making a killing on the wine money, suddenly had empty bars. The weavers and carpenters who had sold their tools to buy bulbs were left holding rotting flowers. But here is the dark twist that historians often leave out. Why did they do it? Why did rational Dutch people risk everything? It wasn't just greed. It was death. You have to remember the context. 1636 wasn't just the year of the tulip. It was a year of the bubonic plague. The Black Death was tearing through the Netherlands. In some cities, 20% of the population died that year. When you see your neighbors dropping dead in the street, when you don't know if you'll wake up tomorrow, you stop caring about long-term financial planning. You stop saving for retirement. You adopt a fatalistic nihilism. Why not bet the farm on a flower, they thought. I might be dead by Wednesday anyway. If I win, I live like a king. If I lose, well, the plague might get me before the debt collector does. The Tulip Mania was a frantic, desperate dance on the edge of a grave. It was a society trying to feel alive, trying to grab a piece of glory before the lights went out. The plague eventually passed, but the survivors were left staring at a mountain of debt that nobody could pay. The Dutch economy was effectively frozen. So, what happens when a financial system collapses because of a flower? The government had to step in, and what they did next is a masterclass in kicking the can down the road. They didn't bail everyone out. They didn't print money. They essentially shrugged and said, "Look, guys, let's just pretend this never happened." The courts in Haarlem and Amsterdam ruled that the contracts signed during the mania were effectively gambling debts. They weren't treated as serious trade agreements. This meant they couldn't be enforced by law. Sellers were told they could keep their bulbs. Buyers were told they didn't have to pay the full price. In many cases, contracts were settled for 3.5% of the face value, or they were just torn up entirely. If you were a wealthy merchant who speculated with play money, you were fine. You took a hit. You complained about it at the country club, and you moved on to trading spices again. But if you were a weaver who sold his loom, or a farmer who sold his cows, you were ruined. The assets you sold to enter the market were gone, and the asset you bought was now worthless compost. The rich stayed rich, and the poor got a harsh lesson in market volatility. The Semper Augustus, that bulb worth a mansion? Within a year, it was just a flower again. Pretty to look at, sure, but you couldn't trade it for a ham sandwich, let alone a house. It is very easy to look back at the Dutch in 1637 and laugh. It's easy to say, wow, Look how stupid those people were in the olden days, buying onions for the price of mansions. We would never do that. But wouldn't we? We look at them, but then we look at the dot-com bubble of the 90s. We look at the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. We look at the frantic rise of NFTs, where digital pictures of monkeys sold for millions of dollars. We look at meme coins that have no utility other than number go up. The vehicle changes. Sometimes it's a tulip, sometimes it's a website, sometimes it's a digital token. But the psychology? The psychology never changes. It is the eternal human desire to get something for nothing, to beat the system, to believe that the laws of gravity don't apply to us. We tell ourselves the most dangerous lie in finance. This time is different. The Dutch weren't stupid. They were just the first ones to discover that markets are driven by emotion, not logic. They were the pioneers of the bubble. The Tulip Mania wasn't really about flowers. It was about us. It was about the contagious madness of the crowd. So, the next time you see an investment that looks too good to be true, the next time your Uber driver, your barber, and your aunt are all telling you to buy the same sure thing, do yourself a favor. Go to the grocery store. Buy a bouquet of tulips for $10. Put them in a vase. Watch them bloom and watch them die. And remember Winkle. Remember the sailor who ate the $1,000,000 onion. Because history doesn't always repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And usually it rhymes with broke. If you want to avoid trading your house for a vegetable, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We decode the madness of history so you don't have to repeat it. I'll see you in the next one. Don't buy the peak.